Good morning, everybody. In a couple minutes, I think we'll get started here once everyone is all set. Good morning, everyone, again. I appreciate, first of all of you who are joining us this morning for this book launch, and I want to especially thank Sonny Rosen and all the staff at LSU Press for hosting this and making this possible. In case some of you don't know who I am, I'll just give a brief introduction. My name is Gregg Andrews. I grew up in the Hannibal area on the Mississippi River in a little village about 3 miles south of Hannibal. And from the time I was a child, I fell in love with the river. And I think, in some way or another, most of what I've done in the way of books and scholarship have generally focused on the lives of everyday people in the Mississippi River Valley. I spent 21 years as a faculty member at Texas State University. I retired in 2009. I guess you could say I retired. But I've been very active in the 15 years since then in way of research and writing and music. I'm also a musician and songwriter, and the river has also played a very important cultural shaping influence on the growth of my music over the years. Let me first of all just show you the cover of my new book, Hard Times in an American Workhouse. And the focus, and I want to thank Michelle Newstrom, who designed this, by the way. It's just a wonderful, chilling jacket cover. Um, People have asked me, well, how did you, first of all, what is a workhouse? And how did you get interested in writing this book? Well, it came as a spinoff from my previous book with LSU Press called Shanty Boats and Roustabouts, where I was looking at the River Poor in the St. Louis area and more broadly in the Mississippi River Valley. And while I was researching and writing that book, I kept coming across cases in which people were sent to the workhouse. And I became intrigued by that. This is in the 19th century and also into the 20th century. On several occasions, I'd find roustabouts, uh, for example, being sent to the workhouse, and other people as well. And so I kind of filed that away in the back of my mind. And while I was writing Shanty Boats and Roustabouts, at the same time I was also doing research on the workhouse itself. Where is the workhouse located that I'm focused on? It was on the South Levee in St. Louis, at a place where it was known at the time as Workhouse Landing, or there just below it was a shanty boat settlement known popularly in the area as Chicken Town. It's on a place called at the time was called Point Breeze. Stood high up on a limestone bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. And today around 4200 South Broadway is where that's located. And the limestone bluffs provided work for the people who were sentenced to the workhouse. And many of them were out there breaking rock as a punishment for committing, usually it was some city ordinance, usually some petty crime. When people ask, well, who was sent to the workhouse? There was nothing in the intent of the workhouse to try to reform people's behavior. It was strictly punitive. And when I set out to write this book, I was kind of surprised as I began to do research to find that very, very little had been written on workhouses in the United States. I was much more familiar with, in the Charles Dickens era in Great Britain and the workhouses of those those eras. But surprisingly, I found very little on writings on workhouses in the United States. What comes out of how someone ended up in a workhouse was that, as I said, they committed some kind of a violation of an ordinance. It might be if you were a peddler selling something and you did not have a license, your punishment might be 6 months sent down. You were sent down to the workhouse maybe for a half a year as a punishment. If you were classified as a vagrant, which is a term that was very broadly and arbitrarily applied by the St. Louis police officers in that particular time. If you couldn't prove, for example, that you had a livelihood, that you had a steady job, if you couldn't convince the police officer on the beat that you had a job, you had a residence. So if you were homeless, you were subject, as a vagrant, you'd be sent down to the workhouse to work off a fine. It might be $10. If it was a more serious kind of offense, the fines went up. So most of the people, I believe about 9 out of 10 who ended up in the workhouse, were sent there by the notorious police courts at the time, justices of the peace. And the way it worked was you were hit with a fine. Now, if you had the money to pay the fine, you were okay. You go back home and resume life as usual. Or if you had friends and connections who had the money, who felt sympathetic and they loaned it to you or gave it to you and bailed you out, then you were okay. But if you were poor and you did not have the money to pay that fine, that's when you were sent to the workhouse. And as you can imagine, I mean, the inmates also came from the criminal courts, who, by way of plea deals, they were given a lesser sentence in order to, oftentimes the court were backlogged. And so as a quick remedy, they would plead guilty and be sent to the workhouse for 6 months or a year as an option. So you get different kinds of inmates coming in here. You get people who, for example, in some cases were there simply because they were homeless or they were old and couldn't take care of themselves. I even came across examples, especially in the in the early years. And this particular workhouse was at this location in 1853. It had moved from a previous location that it had occupied for about 10 years. But especially in those early years, I found cases where someone would ask to be sent to the workhouse because they had no other options. They were on the verge of starvation. And a mayor might send a note down to the workhouse and say, admit this person, committed no violation of any ordinance, let him out when he's ready to go. So you find a few cases like that. And some people learn to play the system. Some people who were let out, if they ran short of money and they didn't have a place to stay, they knew what it took to get arrested by the police officer. And it'd be some petty thing, and then back to the workhouse they go. But for the most part, the overwhelming part, the penal aspects of it drove the system. If you were drunk in public, if you were involved in peace disturbance of any kind, these were the traditional ways. sex workers, maybe who didn't refuse to pay, pay the bribe to the cop on the beat. They would be sent down there. People with alcohol problems, people with epilepsy, people who were classified as feeble-minded. You often found them in here. Insane. It's an incredible mix of people thrown together in these very crowded cells to provide the work that the city is going to require them, and to keep peace, so to speak, inside the workhouse. One of the things that I first of all, I set it up by looking at daily life and labor in the inside the workhouse. And one of the things that surprised me, I guess, in a way, is very little changed over the years. You were paid 50 cents a day, minus your room and board, which, depending on what era, was approximately 30 cents, 32 cents. So that's your compensation for it. In the meantime, if you're sent to the quarries, and most were sent to the quarries, given a hammer, sledgehammer, you break up rock. Prisoners who had small fines were not shackled. Prisoners who had a fine of about $25, around that total, then you might get a ball and chain on one leg. But if a fine was over $25, usually 50, I believe, was it, the dividing line, then you were shackled, completely shackled. So depending on your fine, one of the ways you got introduced to the workhouse was you were taken to the shackle shop. And a blacksmith would put those shackles on you. And people who wore those shackles for a long time often developed a very distinctive walk that some said they could recognize them just by watching them walk. A shuffle, a drag and shuffle that came and it stayed with them for life. One of the characteristics that I think, one of the themes that pervades the book, is the brutality of the system, the brutality of the guards, the callousness at best, or brutality of the superintendents who were appointed to run the institutions. As you can imagine, there was all kinds of abuse and corruption. Corruption infected every aspect of workhouse life from day one. And the superintendents were appointed to their positions. Now, in the early years, they were elected annually, I think, and then maybe elected for 2 years. But then they did away with that and made them appointees. So what you get in St. Louis is ward political patronage driving everything. So a superintendent rarely ever was replaced by a mayor. I mean, despite the number of exposés that were done on the workhouse and exposing the worst crimes being committed by the guards and the superintendent who were in charge of the institutions. Women in the early years, women also were sent out on the rock pile, and they were doing the same work as the men, breaking up rock. Usually the women were given smaller pieces to break up, and this rock was taken out, of course, like riprap, crushed stone, that some of the inmates would work outside the institution during the day on city streets, pouring rock, grading and all that kind of stuff. And then they'd come back to the workhouse, in the late afternoon, early evening. But the system was just filled with abuse. And one of the things that got me really interested in this, and at first I thought, well, I'm not I didn't have in mind writing a book on this. I thought maybe an article, maybe an article. I couldn't find any institutional records that survived, for one thing. And so, how was I going to go about this book? I had really no models that to follow. So I did heavy duty newspaper work. I mean, heavy duty, and followed cases, used some legal papers, legal records, city documents to try to put together, the history of this workhouse, which had never been done before. Were there critics? Of course, there were critics. I mean, there were people beaten to death by guards in there. I want to but what I was interested in especially is getting the narratives of the people. Who are the people in here and what's their story or stories? And that's what my primary interest was. And through those newspapers, I was able to get a lot of this information. Fortunately, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, in particular, after 1878, when Joseph Pulitzer bought the newspaper, he was that newspaper was a persistent thorn in the side of the mayors and the workhouse, the superintendents and the guards. It took a number of years, but they finally got an undercover reporter admitted into the workhouse. And so we got firsthand accounts coming from a reporter who was on assignment undercover there. So the Post-Dispatch, no matter what political party controlled St. Louis, the Post-Dispatch held their feet to the fire when it came to the workhouse. Felt it was the most disgraceful institution, and the incredible abuses that went on down there were a disgrace to the city and to the country. So the Post-Dispatch was a huge critic. Later, so was the St. Louis Star, especially in the 1910, 1920 in that area. Women's clubs in St. Louis were very, very active in criticizing the institution. And in one particular case, might have saved this woman's life, who was in solitary confinement for 7 weeks straight in the heat of summertime. And, it was against the law. It violated the ordinance to have physical punishment. But that was a joke, because the whipping post was central to the institution, the use of it by guards and the superintendents to punish people who did not obey the rules of the workhouse. So you find these critics, and they're ongoing criticisms, and usually the mayors, and the superintendents, you just wait until it all dies down, and then life goes on as usual inside the workhouse. What was legal in the ordinance was the use of solitary punishment, solitary confinement. And so we find many, many, many cases of that, and the abuse that went with it, but on the part of the guards. I'd like to want to read this quote. This is from a woman whose name was Mary Morgan. She was a young Black woman who was, when she came into the workhouse, was a very robust person. And she was admitted to the workhouse, and she got into a fight with another woman in the cell. And they punished her by putting her into solitary confinement, which was a separate building. It was not heated. It was not cool. There was no ventilation. In the summertime, it was, a sweat box. In the wintertime, it was brutally cold. in St. Louis. We know, St. Louis winters can get pretty cold, sometimes down 20 below or so. And this is what they put her in the solitary confinement, or the bullpen. They called it the bull ring or the bullpen at different times, as punishment. And this was in December. And she had no socks. She had old, worn out, dilapidated shoes. And she was put in there, and after 2 days, the superintendent came to see her himself. She begged him. Her feet were frozen. She begged him for mercy, asked to have a fire if she could just warm up, just even if it's just for a few minutes, you know. And he mocked her and left, and she remained in there, I think, about 2 weeks. And by the time it was bread and water, that's what she was fed. That's what people in solitary confinement were given. And by the time she got out, she was in horrible shape. And when they got a hold of a friend of hers to come pick her up at the workhouse, her friend immediately called an ambulance. And they sent her to the city hospital. And this is a St. Louis Post-Dispatch reporter went into the room, her hospital room, to talk to her. And this is what she said, and I want to read her words. When my feet were frozen stiff, I begged to be taken to a fire, if only long enough to thaw them. But my begging was met with curses and threats of beating. It would have been less cruel for them to have killed me with an axe than to murder me by such slow degrees as this. And she also contracted tuberculosis while she was in there. And the reporter noted, as he reported on the story, that probably, at least she probably was going to die soon and she'd be out of her misery but he was horrified by the treatment that she had gotten there in the workhouse. So you find all kinds of cases like this, in doing research. And so, you see some beginnings of reform attitudes toward the penal system. The workhouse, in the early 1900s, Mayor Rolla Wells, and really the Mayor Kreisman, Mayor Keel, Wells, of course, was a Democrat. The other two there that I mentioned were Republicans, and they tried to promote more modern ideas, approaches to prison reform. The St. Louis Civic League played an important role as a reform group there. They put out a report on the workhouse in 1911. It was just devastating. And they pointed out that what had happened, this whole system had amounted to debt imprisonment. You find poor people come getting in there and sometimes never getting out, because if they did anything wrong, if they looked at a guard wrong, in some cases, didn't follow a command, if you were a little hard of hearing and guard told you to do something and you didn't do it fast enough, you're probably going to get a beating, and then you're also going to have time tacked onto your sentence. And so you had people in there some of them who practically lived in the workhouse. But there were these early signs of reform coming out here in the early 1900s. And I think the one case that maybe sparked it as much as anything, and this was one of the cases that drew my attention, and I was going to write an article on her, and she, as it turned out, she occupies a full chapter in the book. Her name was Mary Duff, and she was sent to the very, very, very intelligent woman, a former teacher, a writer, a political critic, and was sympathetic with the anarchist movement in St. Louis, where there was a small anarchist movement at the time. And when the Haymarket martyrs were executed in Chicago, she protested. And so from that moment on, she put out a flag, hung a flag of mourning outside her tenement building window, and a crowd came and started, throwing rocks and stuff, and then the police came and arrested her, of course. they called her the little Pine Street anarchist. She was a very, very, like I said, she was a very critical-minded person. I was never able to flesh out exactly what her political views were, but I accepted that what I had was that she also, if she wasn't an anarchist, she was sympathetic with anarchist thought at the time. Did not believe, she did not believe in, she believed in common law marriage, what is considered a radical, for that particular era. And she was constantly in trouble with the police for one thing or another. And she was on one of the occasions, and I believe it was around 1898. The superintendent just she refused to sew, and to punish her, he put her in solitary confinement, and she almost died, and she refused to break. And they kept it up and kept it up. And some wealthy woman out on the West End in St. Louis found out about the case and hired Daisy Barbie, who was one of St. Louis's early women lawyers, to represent her case. And she instituted lawsuits against the superintendent, who eventually was removed, not reappointed to that office, and the city. And she won a tiny settlement on one aspect of the case, but it really brought attention to the city of St. Louis in a big way. And so I found her to be one of the most fascinating people whose cases I ran into there in the book. Also, I have a chapter on the industrial workers of the world, political radicals, from 1914 to 1915. They spent a winter in the workhouse there. And so, I think in general, besides the people who could not pay their fines, adulterers, if you were married and having an affair with someone, you're open for a sentence to the workhouse. And that happened. I found some fascinating cases in which that happened, including a guy who became a doctor, a medical doctor there in St. Louis eventually. But as a med student, he was found cheating on his wife, and she prosecuted him. And it's a very fascinating story. I don't have time to tell it here today, but I think you find that fascinating reading. But I think that to wrap things up here, and then we want to open it up to questions. I think the major impulse toward reforming that institution came in the form of a municipal farm. That was popular among criminal justice reformers at the time, people who were interested in penal reform. More of a decentralized kind of operation where you don't have these crowded cells occupied by in some cases a hardened criminal, and next to them you got someone who's there because they're too old, or they have an issue with alcohol, and so how do you separate all that? That became the challenge, and I think that was the most interesting proposal that was put forth. It was supported heavily by one of the superintendents, whose name was one of the most interesting of all the superintendents that I ran into, Frank Primavesi. And he eventually was run out of there because of his fellow, he was a Theodore Roosevelt Republican, and in the election of 1912, that was a no-no in terms of the old line Republican stalwarts. And so they kept after him and after him because they saw him as a traitor to the party. And they were interested in patronage given people who deserved it, in other words, that position. But to wrap this up, they held a bond election in 1920 in St. Louis, whether or not to favor or to oppose the creation of this municipal farm to replace the workhouse, and it failed. And even though the workhouse goes on in that particular location until 1966, I stop it at 1920 because after that, I think there's no hope ever of trying to reform that institution after 1920. And that's why I stopped my study there. Today, St. Louis citizens still, many will refer to the institution that replaced it, which was a medium security prison. They still call it the workhouse, but the one that I'm studying, is the old workhouse. And I think at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions, Sonny. If people who want to make comments or ask further questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you. The first question we have in the comments is from Callie. Question is about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which famously caught fire. Would that be considered an example of a workhouse, or was that simply considered manufacturing?
No, it was manufacturing. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, I assume the one she's referring to, the one in 1911 where the women died by fire. But no, that's a different thing. Yeah, the workhouse, people are being sent there because they could not pay a fine. They did not have the money to pay a fine. And it could be whatever ordinance, it could be a wide range of things. But that was the bottom line. But that was a very different situation.
Thank you. We have one or two follow-up questions from Callie. Next question is, how did the St. Louis Workhouse compare to other Missouri and regional facilities, such as the Glore Psychiatric Hospital that had workhouse-like programs?
Well, that's a good question. I think, we need more studies of those institutions. Kansas City had, they touted theirs at Leeds. They touted that as a model example of a municipal farm. And to my knowledge, there's been no study of that. In regard to the other St. Louis institutions, I think all of those institutions, they were starved for money. I mean, the politicians didn't want to put money into it wasn't very popular. And so they had to do the best they could. And I mentioned earlier that, you find some people who are insane. St. Louis had a hospital, but for some reason, many of them still ended up in the workhouse. But I think that, those institutions generally, they're similar in certain ways to the workhouse, but the fundamental intent and purpose of the workhouse was very different from them.
Thank you. Another follow-up question there. Did people ever get admitted to the workhouse due to race or immigration status?
The race, yes. In fact, I argue in my book that in effect the workhouse criminalizes blackness because the vagrancy statute was interpreted very, very, very liberally. And so, especially after the Civil War, when Black families who had been separated through enslavement, they try to reunite, they try to find each other. St. Louis, as a river city, attracts a lot of attention, a lot of traffic coming, steamboat traffic coming in, and passengers getting off there, maybe in some cases trying to find their relatives, or roustabouts, who in St. Louis primarily were probably 2/3 of them were Black, who worked on the steamboats, in the most difficult of labor done on the Mississippi River. They were at the very end, very bottom, of the social scale, and they were, they couldn't say, if a police officer stopped them and said, if they just unloaded the boat and they don't know when they're going to work again, if they can't show that they have an address, if they have a steady job, it all depends on the arresting officer. And you can kind of guess what that means. You could be arrested even if you had not committed a crime, just because you were in a company or you were seen with being in the company of someone who had committed a crime. If you were unemployed, the assumption was you were a criminal or you were a criminal in waiting. And of course, with the poverty, with the poverty of many freedmen after the war, and and when I in shanty boats and roustabouts, I mentioned the pool halls. A lot of roustabouts would go in, and they hadn't slept for a long, long time, and they'd sit in a pool hall chair. And if they'd nod off asleep, and the police officer would come in and he'd catch you if you didn't have one eye open, you were taken, arrested, and you had a fine. And most cases they couldn't pay the fine. So yes, your question, which is an excellent one. One of the guards boasted to a group of investigators, and this really is very telling because he bragged that Black women who came to the institution were beaten routinely as a way of getting introduced to the workhouse. He assumed the board members were going to like that. And so that tells you something right there about the institutionalized racism that existed within that institution. And roustabouts, in many cases, according to the record, we don't know their names. But you can, so there you're left to speculate about how many of them. We know after 1877, after the St. Louis Commune, where labor took over the city for a while, many roustabouts were sent to the workhouse as a punishment for that. People on the levee, people who lived on the levee, for supporting that protest movement that led to the St. Louis Commune. So yes, I mean it's a recurrent theme throughout my book in terms of of being arrested because of racism. In regard to the other part of your question, I didn't find anything about immigration status. But again, but with the race question, yes.
Thank you. In terms of future projects, is your next project going to be sort of in a similar thread to this one? Are you thinking of doing something else? What are you reading about now?
Well, I just finished drafting a manuscript on the shoe workers in Hannibal, Missouri, in my hometown. And my mother was a shoe factory worker. Just about everybody in everybody's family was a shoe worker in Hannibal at one time or another. Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, all kinds of family combinations. Worked for the International Shoe Company, which was based in St. Louis. Those were its headquarters. And so I've been writing a 20th century study of the growth of the shoe industry and how the International Shoe Company came to dominate the shoe factory business in Hannibal, and which, of course, is, as I assume many of you know, Mark Twain's boyhood hometown, and it's Hannibal's self-styled America's hometown. And so that's what I've been doing lately. I try to stay busy, and I have I'm very intellectually curious, let's put it that way. And I have wide-ranging interest. And I think one of the values of doing research, if we have other students out there, for example, is that you keep, in doing that research, you get spin-offs. You come across other things, like the workhouse. I would have never thought I'd be writing about an American workhouse. I'd never given it that much thought. But as a labor historian, once I got into this, I realized what I had, and the extent to which the United States used forced labor. I mean, St. Louis paved its streets with this labor. Among other things, the wharf. They at one point they had a brush factory in there. Sewing. So the compulsory use of compulsory labor after the Civil War was of great interest to me personally. But so this new book, though, I'm very excited about it. I know a lot of people have reached out to me about it already, and we're hoping that we'll get a good report. We'll get some good reports on the part of readers, and with any luck, we'll do it right here with LSU Press again. It seems like it was less than 2 years ago we did the launch here on Facebook for shanty boats and roustabouts. So hopefully we'll be doing it again in a couple of years, if not sooner.
Thank you so much. Well, on that note, that is our last question, so we can go ahead and say thank you and goodbye to the audience.
Yeah, well, again, thank you to everyone for taking time today. I really do appreciate it a lot. And thank you, Sonny.